When thinking about recording drums, most people imagine at least a dozen microphones around the drum kit, which is really cool, but not everybody can afford such a setup. So what if you only have 2 microphones? Well, in this video I'm going to show you how to record and mix a full drum set using just 2 or even 1 microphone. I tested 6 different pairs of microphones, all different builds and different price tags, starting at 5,000 euro for one pair, all the way down to 100 euro for a microphone. Let's have a look at the microphone positioning first. Very straightforward. Only 2 microphones. One is pointing directly at the snare from just above the snare, and the other one is coming right over my right shoulder and also pointing at the snare and also obviously at the better head of the bass drum. As for the distance of the microphones, you can use something around 1.5 or 2 drumstick lengths. And you can also take this as a measurement to see if both microphones are equally far away from the snare, and ideally also equally far away from the bass drum. So in the end, when you pan those both microphones, the bass drum and the snare will end up more or less in the center. I know this setup looks weird because you think, that's not going to give us a good stereo image, but you would be surprised as how accurate the stereo image actually is. Okay, let's start with the most expensive pair. 5,000 euro for this beautiful pair of Pearlman TM-1s. They are large diaphragm condensers with tubes. Let's listen to what it sounds like. Now I'm going to show you the raw track, what it sounds like, and what I did to it to make it fit in the mix. That sounds already pretty nice, right? These microphones have a solid low end and a lot of detail, but we want to tweak it a little bit more to fit well into the mix. Let me engage all the plugins I used, and then I'm going to show you what these individual plugins do to just shape the sound a little bit more. One of the main differences is the low end. If we want it to sound like a fully recorded drum kit, we need that little extra oomph down there. And the main tool I used for this is Split EQ by Eventide. This is basically a transient designer type of plugin where you can individually shape either the attack or the sustain of different parts of the frequency region, which is really handy here. So what I did is I wanted to boost some punch on the bass drum and on the low fundamental of the snare, while at the same time also removing a little bit of sustain of the bass drum, because if I was just boosting low end, then it would get a little bit too boomy. So for the snare, I just boosted the attack of the low fundamental, which is around 190 Hertz here, and I wanted to remove a little bit of harshness from the hi-hat and the crash, so I pulled down a little bit of the attack of the high end. Let's see what this sounds like with and without. So it gets much warmer and it almost sounds as if we had a bass drum microphone. Now here we have an EQ that's looking pretty wild, but I was going back and forth between this transient shaping tool and the regular EQ, just trying to dial in the right amount of punch and low end and certain frequencies, and I just ended up with this curve. But I'm going to show you why I did what I did. First of all, I have a low cut that is working only on the sides. This microphone configuration makes it pretty hard to get really the bass drum and the snare absolutely dead center. But that's not too bad if the snare is a little bit out, but I would like to have the low end information dead in the center. So by removing some bass from the sides, we keep the low end only in the center. As a next step, I wanted to remove some honkiness from the bass drum. I wanted the low end punch, but not the first harmonics of the bass drum. I'm going to show you what this band does here. It's this honky part of the bass drum that I didn't want. I wanted it to sound full and deep and not so mid-rangey. Let me bypass it to see what it sounds like without. That's an extreme difference, right? The one is woolly and like messy in the low mids, and if I carve this out, then it's getting very clear and very transparent. You may say, yeah, but now you're also carving out low fundamental from the snare. Yes, I had to because I can't access the bass drum directly, but I have a little fix to get something back for the snare that I'm going to show you in a second. Next here we have a little resonance from the snare. Let me bypass those two bands. This is just tightening up the snare. There was a little kook like resonance on the snare that I didn't like too much, so I just carved it out. Next is a little dip here to make the snare a little bit warmer and fuller. Now the snare sounds warmer and not so abrasive on the ear. And finally, also a little roll off at the highs just to keep the cymbals a little bit softer and the whole kit a little bit warmer. That's the whole EQ thing. Now, I told you that I had to carve out some low mids to clear up the bass drum, but I was losing a little bit of low fundamental on the snare. So what I did is I used another EQ, which is working in a dynamic mode, and it is triggered by a sidechain signal. So what I did is I copy-pasted the snare hits onto a separate track, send this track to a bus that is pre-fader, so I don't have to listen to this sidechain triggering signal, and this signal is coming in on this dynamic EQ. So I have Pro Q4 by FabFilter, and I have it set to dynamic. So what it does is it's reacting to this sidechain signal coming in, and every time that the snare is playing, we get a little boost around the fundamental and a little dip also in the mid-range just to clear up the snare a little bit. Listen to the difference. So without this little boost and dip, the snare sounds a little bit thin and a little bit papery in the mids, and this is just curing it. And that was about it. These microphones sound already pretty nice on their own, but we shaped them a little bit to get a little bit more oomph and a little bit more clarity and just let the drums sit nicely in the music. Now the next pair of microphones is the second most expensive of this little test. This is a pair of Schoeps small diaphragm condensers. They cost around €3,200 for a pair, and let's listen to what they sound like. Now let's also listen to the raw track. They also sound pretty nice, and the treatment I did on them was pretty similar to what we had on the large diaphragm tube condensers, but there were one or two little differences that I'm just going to point out. First of all is they don't have as much low end as the large diaphragm condensers, so I added a tiny little bit of static EQ on the bass drum. The little resonance that I cut out of the snare are the same as the little roll-off on the highs. In split EQ, I felt the need to tame the snare a little bit more. That's why I pulled out a lot of tonal information around 2K just to make the snare a little bit more soothing. And we also used the little sidechain dynamic EQ trick. Except that for this microphone, I also did this with the bass drum. So what I did is I also put a sidechain bass drum track. I just copy pasted the individual bass drum hits to a separate track, send it on another bus, which is coming in this EQ. And now we get a little boost around the fundamental of the bass drum and a little pulling out of some mids every time the bass drum is playing, just to let it sound a little bit tighter. It also sounds nice without this treatment, but I was listening to the drums in context with the music when I was tweaking around. And this is also an advice that I would like to give you. Don't twist too many knobs while listening to something in solo. Listen in context and you will probably take different decisions and better decisions, because nobody is going to listen to this drum track in solo except we do now. Okay, let's move on to the next pair of microphones. The next pair of microphones is a pair of dynamic hypercardioid microphones, Beyerdynamic M201. I love these on snare, on toms, even on bass cabinet, but how do they sound on a complete drum kit? Let's find out. Not too bad for just a couple of dynamic microphones. Let's listen to the raw tracks and what we did to them. Overall, pretty nice sound. They get a little bit thin around the bass drum, so we will have to beef that up a little bit. Let's see how we did this. I used a general boost around 40 Hz, which is the fundamental range of this bass drum. Again, rolled off the sides in the lows to keep the bass centered. These are the same moves as on the other microphones. On split EQ, we also used a little transient boost around 40 Hz. I also used the low cut with a slightly narrow Q factor so that we get this little bump around the cutoff frequency, so we can clean up low end, too much rumble in the lows, while at the same time boosting a little bit the fundamental of the bass drum. And again, we used split EQ to heavily boost the fundamental of the snare drum, while at the same time removing some honkiness and some harshness from the snare. This fundamental boost of the snare really gives the impression that we had a snare microphone on top of the snare, which is really cool. You may wonder, where is the compression on the drums? Do you want to see some compression on drums? Well, I actually didn't use any compression on the drums. I just have a tiny bit of compression on the master bus, but not on the drums individually. And with this type of recording, like with two microphones or even just one microphone, it is really crucial that you are in control of the dynamics while you are playing. So if you are bashing the cymbals or hit the snare too soft, or if there is some kind of unbalance in the kit, then it's getting difficult to mix this correctly. So when you're recording in such a Spartanic way, really take care of the dynamics of your playing. It's really, really important. Okay, let's move down the price tag list and we arrive at a pair of Aston Origin, which is, let's say, the entry-level microphone of the British company Aston. This is a normal large diaphragm condenser, and let's see how it sounds like. Not too bad for a pair of microphones costing only 440 euros. So let's listen to the raw track what this sounds like. And as we can see, I pulled down quite a bit of around 200 Hz just to remove this honkiness from the bass drum. I pull down a little bit more high end so that the hi-hat and the cymbal is not going to be too abrasive. But except from this, the processing is pretty much the same as for the other microphones. Of course, we also have to check out ribbon microphones on the drums. And here I have a pair that cost around €400, so let's listen to what they sound like. Let's listen to the raw track also. So yeah, they sound pretty thick as we would expect from ribbon microphones and also darker than the condenser microphones. Here I needed to clean up the low end a little bit more than for the other microphones. So what I did is my low cut on the sides was a little bit steeper and a little bit higher than before. And I also cut out a bigger chunk of low end here so that the bass drum would sound a little bit tighter. Let's listen to the difference. Without this EQ, it's getting a little bit woolly and messy in the low end. Here also we added a little bit of punch in the low end, but I removed much more sustain from the fundamental of the bass drum just so that it doesn't get too boomy. And since we had enough low end on these microphones anyway, I still used the sidechain trick, but not to boost low end, but just to clean up a little bit when the snare was hitting. Just removing a little bit of woodiness from the snare so that it sounds nice and crisp. So now, before we move to the cheapest microphones of this little test, the good old Shure SM57, if you want to see how I record and mix a drum set using a complete set of microphones, you can check out this video and also put a link to it in the description below. Now let's listen to the SM57, €200 for one pair of microphones. Would you have guessed that this is just two SM57s? Not sure if I would have guessed it. Let's listen to what they sound like raw. As we would expect for a pair of dynamic microphones, when they are a little bit further away from the source, we are lacking some low end, so we need to beef that up. So we also used split EQ, added a huge amount of low end for the bass drum, a huge amount of low end for the snare. And since the SM57s tend to be a little bit straightforward in the higher mids, I also removed a big chunk here just to keep them a little bit softer. And again, also for the snare, I used some sidechain EQing. I added a ton of fundamental around 200 Hz and also removed some paperiness from around 420 Hz and removed even more 2K to keep the snare nice and soft. So yeah, boosting the fundamentals of the bass drum and the snare is the main move of all these mixes, because if you don't have this, it always sounds a little bit demo-ish. It sounds thin and pretty roomy, but really boosting the fundamental, you give the impression that there has been a close microphone picking up the body of the instruments. I'm pretty amazed at how well a pair of 57s held up against €5,000 microphones. But what if you only have one SM57? Let's listen to this in mono and see what we did to make this work in the mix. Yeah, it's not super high fidelity, but it's just one microphone worth €100 for a complete drum set in a complete full mix, and it's working. So that is really amazing for me. Here, what I did is I added a little bit of room just to give this mono microphone a little bit of spread. Just a little bit of spicy reverb from Safari pedals. There you have pretty vibey plugins. I love what they do. And on this microphone, I added a little bit of compression as well. To get a little bit more tightness. By the way, I used the microphone that was just on top of the snare. So it was the same setup as before, but I just kicked out the microphone that was pointing over my shoulder. So except for a little bit of compression and a little bit of reverb, the processing is exactly the same as with the pair of SM57s. Okay, I hope this was enjoyable for you to watch, and maybe it encourages you to give it a go. Use one microphone, use two microphones, try this setup, try different setups. Let me know if you have a setup that works very well for you, for a minimalistic setup. Let's share it with all the viewers, and I'm really curious what you come up with. Thanks for watching, and see you in another video. Bye bye, take care.